One of the ways that the world has shifted since the Industrial Revolution, if not before, and also Buddhism has shifted, is that the connection to the lunar cycle or to the solar cycle is slowly replaced by the kind of academic or work calendars that don't follow any particular visible rhythms in the movement of planets, right? And that's a loss. You know, it's a loss. So, solstice means, has the etymology sun standing still, which of course it's our, earth-centered perspective that the sun seems to be moving around. We know that's not the case. We are moving in our tilt. And in the winter solstice, the northern hemisphere is tilted as far away from the sun as it's going to get, and it stops. And then we begin to tilt back, and the days once again become longer and the nights become shorter. And we think of the winter and summer solstice as days, but it's not a day. It's a moment. It's just that one instant when we reach the maximum tilt and then start coming back. Just that instant when the movement starts coming back. And for those of us who use the breath in meditation, we also work with this idea that we're breathing in and out continually, but there's an instant where the breath out stops and it becomes the breath in. Exhalation becomes inhalation. And that moment, which, since we have some control of our breathing, unlike the tilt of the earth, we can suspend, we can learn to rest in, that instant can be expanded with the breath. And this gives us access to the opportunity to feel that we're resting a little bit longer in the present moment. So we're not making a present moment longer, but we're staying with that sense of stillness, of being between the two moments of the cycle. And so with the solstice, it's similar, but we can't extend it. It's very transitory. And this year it takes place, at least in the East Coast time zone, it takes place at 10:27 on December 21st in the evening. So it's just like that. And from that moment, again, we start to have longer days. We have more time to be outdoors and enjoy the sun. We have more of everything that the sun rays give us: hope, warmth, time to be outdoors. But this sense that renewal or a change happens in those extreme moments, like the stopping of the tilting away and the returning of the tilting towards the sun, that sense of renewal is actually, according to Buddhist teachings, and I think if we think about it, we can, take it outside of Buddhist teachings, not just authorizing it because Buddha said so, that this transitory nature of time, that the past is ending in any given moment and the future is beginning, is not something limited to the solstice, and therefore renewal is not something that's only possible in certain moments of the year. We do have the opportunity in the solstice to observe in a way that everyone can share, and in the way that we can feel in this very sort of deep bone ways that our body responds to hours of sunlight. we can feel that something is shifting. In the case of the winter solstice, this shifting is generally very welcome because, at a certain point it's dark earlier and earlier and earlier, and it's in the evening, and in the mornings it's, later and later before we start having sunlight and getting that boost to our system that tells us, okay, time to be active, which is especially important because we need to be active more than just the hours of daylight if we're somewhere far north around the winter solstice. So we have this joyful kind of experience of like, oh, thank goodness now, the night is going to be shorter and the days will be longer. But this sense of fresh possibilities, of things stopping and starting continually, and the thing that stops is not the same as the thing that starts, is part of the nature of impermanence in this view. And the way in which this very subtle sense of nothing lasting is explained through Buddhist teachings is that every single instant is the result of whatever immediately preceded it, which is also the result of everything that immediately preceded it. And it's not just one thing that preceded it, it's all the conditions that are coming together continually to yield as a collective product that moment. And so in every single moment, all of the conditions that happened before come together and yield something unique. Why is it unique? Because those conditions that are serving as causes for this are also results of other things that are changing. Okay, and so if one thing anywhere in the universe is changing, all of the conditions related to it will be in flux. They will also be changing. I think this is kind of familiar territory. Does this make sense? And so, because in every single moment that complete the configuration of the cells, the movement of the weather patterns, the movement of traffic, the things that are coming towards us and coming away from us are also in movement. We are in any single moment in between what was before and what is about to come. And what was before and what is about to come cannot be the same. Because some things are moving away and some things are moving towards, and some things are being born and some things are dying, and change is happening all the time. And because of this impermanence, if we think carefully what the implications are that nothing remains. There is no remaining or staying in between the coming and going, in between the dying and the ending, right? Every single moment, things are changing. And so no two consecutive moments are identical, which means they are not remaining the same. They are constantly being renewed. And there are elements in physics that we can look to that confirm this. God's particle, Higgs boson, it's called, I think. Forgive me if you're better informed, which I know quite a few of you are. The idea that millions and millions of times every instant, there are particles that are ending and other ones that are coming into existence, and that is how the universe operates. It is constantly renewing itself in the most fundamental sense, right? And so the winter solstice is this opportunity for us to watch this writ large in a way that we can feel in our bones. That things are shifting, and there's one moment, and we think that it lasts for a while, but it doesn't. It's just a second, and then we're already tilting back. And we can think of this as a metaphor, we can think of it as a collective experience, but what we are seeing is the nature of all things at work. And we're not just observing or experiencing impermanence, it's also relative. As we are tilting away from the sun, everyone in the other hemisphere are tilting towards it. And in the moment when we are tilting back, they are starting their tilt away. And so it's very clear that depending on where we are in this system, depending on where we are situated in this larger context, our experience is going to be radically different. And so the place-based nature, the contextual-based nature of our experience is also something that the winter solstice puts really front and center. And, when we think about the winter solstice as opposed to the summer solstice, we're celebrating the maximum amount of light, and like the darkness is like kept in the far edges of the day, right? Whereas in the winter solstice, it's like it's crowded back in on us, and we're here and we're like just about to start getting more light. And so the summer solstice in a way is a celebration of light, and if we're not careful, winter solstice also ends up being a celebration of light because we're going to get more of it, and that's good, right? And this is just something I want to put into question. So thinking about what we're celebrating light, and think about what we're missing when we're not also celebrating darkness. And the darkness we have for evolutionary reasons, for psychological reasons, we fear what we cannot see. And darkness and light are about, are the condition, light, the sunlight is a condition for life, but light of any sort is a necessary condition for vision, for that sense faculty. And so the celebrating of light is celebrating, in large part, the ability to see things, right? And when we think about, where we, as children, had most fears, we feared things under the bed because it's dark there. We fear things in the closet because it's dark there. We fear things in the woods because at night it gets very dark if we have, a good coverage. And so when we're celebrating light, we're also, in a sense, acknowledging our very strong visual-based orientation in the world. In the darkness, we're required to use other senses, right? And when it's dark, our eyes start adjusting because we are really oriented towards being able to use our sight, but we also can start to notice other senses. And, if we're in an unfamiliar place and going to the bathroom at night, we're stumbling with our hands out, right? Because we can't see. So we have this sense of insecurity and wanting to use other senses like touch. And vision, apart from light, as a mode of orienting ourselves in the world, and I kind of like just thinking about what it means that we're so strongly visually focused. Because there are other animal species that have developed other senses as their primary and secondary senses besides sight. So vision requires light. It also requires distance. We need to have physical separation from anything that we're seeing. We cannot see something that is directly up against our eyeball. It requires distance. And I think here it's just very interesting that the paradigm that we're working with, the separation of self and other, the, separational paradigm that we've been questioning is very much a paradigm that is favored by visual sensing. Visual sensing requires that kind of separation and confirms that sense of separation because we don't see the space in between. We don't count it. We're just seeing distance. We're not seeing connectedness through that space, right? And so it's just interesting. I mean, even bats, even if there's no light, they require distance for echolocation. So just thinking about what are the senses that require distance and what are the senses that require contact. And, not that there's anything wrong with, sometimes we need to take distance from situations to slow our reactivity, and also sometimes we need to take ourselves out of a context because our presence in there was changing it. And so the distance allows us to see how something looks in motion when we are not directly in it. But this factor of distance, of taking distance in order to understand something, is problematic. Because what it means is we need to believe, sense, posit, or impute a disconnection between ourselves and anything that we're trying to understand. We need to, at least mentally, extract ourselves or project ourselves out of a situation, which means our experience of the world is going to be rooted in the self and other non-interdependent connection very easily. Not necessarily, but very easily. And so thinking again of what it is to walk around in the dark, we're stumbling around with our hands out because we want contact. We want to sense, through our tactile sense. And these are just a few reflections to start to see what forms of knowing we value. We value forms of knowing where we feel like we can analyze something as a scheme that we are not part of. Kind of intellectual, rational, categorizing classification rather than intuitive or sensorial. And that's, I think, pretty, broadly civilizational. We have devalued the forms of knowledge that we feel in the body or forms of knowledge that are emotional or intuitive in favor of the rational and the intellectual. We have also devalued the forms of knowing that non-human animals have. We have devalued the forms of knowing that plants have, the forms of knowledge that we could learn from them, in favor of human knowledge. And again, this is the difference between deep ecology and what we can call shallow ecology. Deep ecology seeks to value or is valuing all the forms of knowledge, not just human, and certainly not just intellectual. Whereas what we can call shallow ecology believes that human beings will use their, superior intelligence and will find a technological solution, and we will think our way or improvise or invent our way out of the crisis that we're in. Whereas deep ecology wants to include and value and learn from all the other forms of intelligence and recognize that there are other forms of intelligence. And so just some of our attitudes towards light and dark and some of the valuing or ways of knowing that underpins, really it kind of merits some questioning. And again, we have been talking about when we essentialize differences and have the dualistic thinking where this is not that, light and dark, two different things. and one is good, and one we don't want. Let's wait for the winter solstice and get more of what we want and get, less of what we don't want. These kinds of dualistic views can be found everywhere. All of the forms of social injustice have these dualistic views. All the forms of ecological injustice have these sorts of, one is dominant and the other one is there to be exploited or to be used. And, in this valuing of light over darkness, we also see as a direct consequence an overlighting of the planet. Terrible light pollution, which, if we're still very sort of human-centered, we can say, oh, yes, we never get to appreciate the skies, which is a big loss. It's a big loss. But there are non-human animal species whose lives are threatened because of light pollution. Sea turtles, the most sort of well-known case. Hatchlings, when they're hatching on beaches that are adjacent to roads, buildings, big hotel complexes that are highly lit at night, they head inland towards those light rather than out to the ocean where normally any starlight is being reflected off the surface, and that's where most light is. And so, millennia of evolution have taught them to go towards that where there is light when they hatch at night. So that's just the most sort of well-known case. There are also many different light-sensitive animals that will delay, birds, for example, they will delay coming out to feed in the dusk because it doesn't look like dusk yet, because there's all the artificial light around, which means they lose their feeding time. Insects that are most abundant at dusk, they shorten that time. And birds that require insects for food usually need to eat that whole time. They're not like, fruit eating birds that can just eat for a few hours a day. The insect ones need to use the whole dusk to eat. And so there are very serious consequences. There are bats that have abandoned their roosts or never leave. They starve to death because the darkness they're waiting for never comes. Terrible stories of migratory songbirds that are circling buildings that are brightly lit until they're exhausted and can't complete their migration, or just die there, or colliding with lighted structures. So there are serious consequences for our preference for light as much as possible. There's also in the human realm, there's the overlighting and light pollution has a very direct social justice issue. Apart from psychologically, being rooted or traceable to a fear of blackness as a social justice issue, if we look at lower income neighborhoods that are mostly where we're going to find, or where most of who we find are either going to be Black or people of color, more likely in many places, they are very often inadequately and excessively lit, right? Bright lighting being associated with safety, and so used as a mode of policing, because those areas are associated with danger, right? And this kind of lighting can have does have adverse effects on human health. It affects your sleep. It affects, it has a lot of effects on the organism. And the years that we were in Mexico, I found that I started to really need a sleep mask because there just was too much lighting, and this kind of very harsh lighting, as a response to danger or perceived danger in the areas that we were living. And so, these are, and it's not necessary to have that kind of light. There are other forms of lighting. So that kind of light pollution also is a social justice issue. And so when we're starting to look at what's going on with our attitudes towards light and darkness, we come to Buddhism, and what do we call how do we translate the term Buddhahood? In English, that's not its root in Sanskrit or in Tibetan, but in English we call it enlightenment, right? And even though light, the metaphor of light does not appear in the Sanskrit and Tibetan terms for awakening, which is my preferred translation for it, because that is, Buddha means coming to know or gaining knowledge, and it also means awakening. But in that term, in the tradition, we have all over the place the darkness of ignorance, right? All of these commentarial texts that are called lamp for this and a light for that. We're going to shed light and we're going to get rid of the darkness of ignorance. So there is this very strong term that's used there. Whereas we can also consider what is not in the light is where our work is. Right? The parts of ourselves that are confused, the parts of ourselves that are not integrated into the whole, the parts of ourselves that are shrouded in shame, no, they are not out here in the light. And when we think about what we need as spiritual practitioners or as Dharma practitioners, we need an ability and a willingness to turn toward that which we do not know. We need an ability to turn toward that which we have not yet embraced. And what we do not yet know is in the metaphorical darkness, and what we have not yet embraced is behind us. We also need the ability to turn toward that which we have not yet healed. And so awakening sometimes is treated in this metaphor of getting rid of problematic parts of ourselves. But actually, if we look carefully, Buddhahood is the integration of all parts of ourselves. It's becoming full and complete. And the path, the Buddhist path, the very first teaching and the first step in the first teaching, which were the 4 truths for nobles, the very first step is turning towards suffering. Recognize that there is suffering. We need to turn towards it. And we know we have such a strong tendency to want to put it behind us, to turn our back on it, to turn away from it, right? How do we work with the ability that we need in order to address suffering when our first instinct is to run or to close a door, right? To gain distance from it. Because on the Buddhist path, it starts with turning towards suffering, and it ends in the Mahayana Buddhist path. The path ends, if it ever does end, with tending to the suffering of the world. The orientation towards a willingness to see suffering and not, obsess on all, doom scroll to eternity, but having an ability and a willingness to acknowledge that they're suffering and having all the resources. That's why Buddhahood is so much about resources. What the term that is upaya, that's often translated as skillful, means. I'm currently liking the translation resourcefulness. You're full of resources. You're resourceful. You have methods at your disposal, and you're not waiting to be told which method to use. You are resourceful, right? So the resourcefulness that allows us to respond to difficult situations without, feeling oppressed or confronted with our own impotence. But however we want to understand what the task of the path is, the fact of needing to turn towards or to be willing to address parts of ourselves that we generally keep out of the light is, has been identified as long ago, in Western psychology as Carl Jung, as what is often now referred to as shadow work. And so shadow meaning the aspects of ourselves that are incompatible with or contradict the persona or the characteristics that we do appreciate and we want to project out into the world, that we want to have in the light. We want to be seen and to see ourselves as this sort of person, and what is not compatible with it gets pushed back into the shadow. So the metaphor of shadow, is very visceral in that way. And this recognition that when we catch a glimpse of elements of ourselves that we generally want to keep in the shadow, when they start coming up, we want to avoid seeing them or acknowledging them. When we see them in others, when we see the characteristics that are part of ourselves that we are trying to keep in the shadow, we can have a very strong adverse reaction to that. Either because we've labeled them as bad, we don't want to see them, we don't want to be in contact with them, we don't want to be anywhere near them, or because how come that person gets to be like that and I have to keep mine in the shadow? So a kind of resentment that other people are out there able to embody it. And so this, I'm kind of just wanting to mention it now because there is a tendency in the spiritual path to get tools for developing or having more visible and central and maybe larger the parts of ourselves that we think are good. How much we like feeling virtuous when we're doing the things that are considered virtuous. And nothing against virtue. Virtuous, by definition, good. And yet, in certain ways of experiencing our spiritual path, we get into what has been famously called by John Wellwood spiritual bypass, where instead of addressing and integrating the parts of ourselves that need to be tended to, we get to reinforce and expand the positive persona that is casting all the other stuff into the shadow. So we identify ourselves as a good person and we get validated by our communities or by our teacher or by our practice itself as good people, reinforce, sort of putting out there, having maybe more vocabulary and more ways of presenting a certain positive persona. And that can be at the cost of, either things about ourselves that we were told were bad and never learned to use properly, elements of ourselves whose power and force scares us, potentials that we were never told could and should be developed, or issues, wounds that haven't healed and that are causing problems. And the one companion that's always sitting in our shadow with everything else that's there, accompanying all of it that's there, is shame. We're ashamed that we have these aspects of ourselves, and the shame, by its nature, wants to keep them in the shadows. And so we have, there's a real, self-reinforcing thing that we can get into in spiritual practice, where no, I'm this, and I want to be this, and it's better for me to be this because, oh my God, if I'm that, no. And I don't want to be that, and I don't want to be seen as that, and I don't want anyone else to see me as that. And yet, everywhere we walk, we're casting a shadow if we're walking in the light. and that is always with us. And so just as a way of reflecting that spiritual awakening, and in the Buddhist path specifically, becoming a fully enlightened or a fully awakened person means having the ability to see, to appreciate, to use, to harness, and especially to integrate all aspects of ourselves. Right? And when we think about potential, the potential to awaken, our Buddha nature, which is a potential, everything that we have not yet seen includes the category of potential. Potential is what's not yet manifest, but it's there waiting to awaken, able to come forth with the right conditions. And so when we turn away from the darkness, we're also turning away from our potentials, right? And so I just want to make an invitation on this day of the winter solstice to, yes, celebrate the coming day of the winter solstice, to, yes, celebrate that we are, the earth is going to have more of life-giving sunlight falling on it, and things will blossom and potentials will emerge, but also to celebrate the darkness from which the potentials emerge. Celebrate the fact that there is much more to us than what we can see. And so just make this winter solstice a day where we can value the possibility of accepting and embracing all parts of ourselves and all parts of our experience in the world. We can start just being at ease in our bodies, in whatever position or to whatever degree our bodies are able to connect with a sense of ease right now. To do that, we can just notice any points of stress in the body where tension is being held and just letting it loosen. Letting the weight of our body fall into our seat, respond to the call of the earth, trusting that we are held right here where we are. And as we have this direct contact and experience of our bodies from the inside, we can note also that our body is not isolated. It's connecting, it's contacting. And so this fundamental fact of being continually called and held by the earth can open a pathway for us to expand our awareness of where we are in relation to everything around us. And since we happen to be sitting today just a few days from the winter solstice, those of us who are in the northern hemisphere, we can remember and feel that our bodies, like the earth at this moment, is tilted away from the sun. So we can feel ourselves sticking up from the planet's surface on this tilt. And we're doing this in perfect synchrony with all the other animals seated or walking on this planet. Those in the north tilting away from the sun. Those in the south tilted towards it. And because of this tilt, we can sense or imagine that we're casting long shadows throughout much of the day. And as we walk into the sun, our shadow is at our back. But we can also turn and walk towards our shadow. And depending where we're seated, we might be looking toward or away from our shadows. And so, sitting right now in the daytime, sensing the sunlight that's filling our skies, above or below the clouds. Let's just take a moment to welcome that light, and see if we can generate also an attitude of welcoming of all the shadows that play across the surface of the earth as we move, or that we're casting right now. And for those of us who are sitting indoors, the shadow that's being cast might be more metaphorical. And so let's just sit for a minute or two, asking ourselves, what is that metaphorical shadow? Those attributes or characteristics that are not compatible with how we wish to see ourselves or to be seen. What is there in our shadows that might need to be welcomed, or at least turned towards and addressed? And so in these days, as we move towards the winter solstice, we are still moving towards time of extending darkness. Having the opportunity to connect with it, to welcome it, knowing that very soon we'll experience that key instant when the earth and the sun meet at the ultimate point of tilt, and the earth starts turning back, and the days become longer again, and the nights shorter. And see if we can generate a sense of welcome, of the opportunity of this moment to be in the shadows, to turn towards them, and so to use the rhythm of the planets and the sun to mark inner rhythms in our own lives.